I hope you enjoy, and make sure you follow on Instagram and Snapchat. Username is Dan Asfero. Hey Guru Nation, welcome back to our monthly webinar on the Clinical Trials Guru. We've got Chris Sauber here. Say hello, Chris.
Hello, Chris.
So why are we doing this webinar? We for those who don't know, and make sure if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you go to the blog, theclinicaltrialsguru.com, and you subscribe to the email newsletter. I only send like one a month, but I will let you know, and for those of you on Facebook Live also, make sure you do that. I will let you know when these monthly webinars are going to be, the day before. So the last webinar we did in October, last month, that was, I forgot what the topic was, but we got a lot of questions, and I'm hoping everyone here will type in your questions. So we got a lot of questions last time at the end about PI oversight, and we got into some potential fraud-related questions that sites were having. Mm-hmm. And so Chris and I thought, we should probably put something like this out there because there's not much out there on this topic. And you have an interesting, you haven't done any scientific research or studies on this, but you had some stats where, in your opinion...
Well, I don't know about stats, but insight.
Insight. You believe that X percentage of sites... Go ahead and tell them, because I don't want to butcher what you were saying.
Sure. So, from the investigational meetings I've been to, conversations I've had with numerous sites, it would seem there's three categories of PI oversight. You have PIs that really do nothing other than sign documents. You have PIs that are involved, but not to the extent that they're supposed to be. And then you have PIs that do everything as they should. And the breakdown of that, it would seem to me, it's about 40% of the PIs do absolutely nothing. They're not involved whatsoever.
Very good.
40% do nothing other than sign the documents and meet with the monitors. They have no clue what's going on with their subjects or even the trial itself. They have no clue.
That's very reassuring.
Yes. Then you have about 40% who they're involved, and to differing degrees. Some, every once in a while they won't have the chance to do some assessments. They'll have somebody else do it and sign off on it. They may be, almost 100% involved, or maybe only 20% involved to the extent they're supposed to be. There's a wide range there, mm-hmm. But at least they have an idea of what's going on in the study and what the patient's involved. And I would say that's another 40%. And then about 20%, again, this is with my experience, all the sites I talked to, investigational meetings and coordinators I've talked to, and PIs themselves. And then you have 20% do everything as they should.
Okay.
That would be my guess from the conversations I've had.
And from the conversations I've had with monitors, with CRAs, throughout the years, it seems like from 2012, maybe a little earlier, the FDA has been focusing on PI oversight specifically. Like, they released new guidance on that a couple years ago. It's one of the things they really want to look at, the PI footprint in the study. And this is what we tell our new clients all the time, because they ask, hey, does our PI have to do this? Does our PI have to do that? And the answer is no. But where sites sometimes tend to cut corners, or PIs tend to cut corners too, is there is a lot of vagueness surrounding the FDA guidance on PI oversight. So there's nothing specific that the PI really is required to look at other than following GCP and keeping subjects safe.
But let's not be confusing either. For our newer audience members, the FDA may not provide oversight, but typically the protocol does. The sponsor does via the protocol.
Right.
There's
guidance, so the PI needs to follow the protocol.
Right.
And so we always tell the sites, hey, your investigator needs to have a footprint. So yeah, they could be delegating like every single procedure to sub-Is or to study coordinators, that's fine, but they should still be doing the consenting when they can, and not always, and we're going to get into the consenting. Does a PI actually have to do it or not? They should be reviewing lab results routinely. Only the PI can sign the safety reports, right? Sub-Is can't sign that, even if they're an MD. So those are the things where your PI needs to have oversight. And if your PI is not doing those things, that's a red flag for the sponsor. And if the site was ever to get audited, that's a red flag, obviously, for the FDA, because they are cracking down on that. And as we're starting to see risk-based monitoring, RBM, being implemented more and more in studies going forward, now we're entering 2017, most of that push has been from sponsors and CROs wanting to push more of the responsibility onto the sites.
Sure.
So the sites have the smallest voice, the quietest voice in the industry, and risk-based monitoring technically does not favor the sites. It favors the CROs and the sponsors. And the sponsors should be favored because they're the ones paying for the study. But it used to be that the CROs took more responsibility for making sure the site is following GCP and the protocol.
Yeah, so
and now with
every 6 weeks.
Right, and now with risk-based monitoring, the FDA is basically saying it's okay for the CROs to not necessarily focus on that, but assign a separate risk profile for each site and just look at different items based on each site, each individual site. So the overall responsibility is going onto the site and by default onto the PI, because that's really who the FDA cares about when they audit a site, is the PI.
Sure.
Right?
It all falls under the PI. That's true.
So let's get into things that a PI should be doing in a study.
Well, as you had mentioned, they can delegate. But a lot of the things, again, in my experience, that sites or doctors at the sites, whether it be PIs or sub-Is, they will delegate things that they should not be delegating.
So what's an example?
Physical exam.
Okay, so they'll delegate physical exam, and who would they delegate that to?
Well, they're supposed to delegate this task to somebody that's has an appropriate education.
Qualified and on the delegation log.
Correct.
To do vitals or physical exam.
Correct.
Right.
However, oftentimes that is not the case, and it might be somebody with a high school education that they're delegating.
Like a coordinator or even worse, like a receptionist.
Yes.
Because I've heard stories of receptionists doing physical exams.
Well,
and they're not on the delegation log. They're doing the physical and the PI signing it as if they're supervising, right?
Well, you and I both worked with an MD.
Oh yeah, let's get into that. This is juicy.
Yeah.
He's since lost his license.
Yes, yeah, since lost his license. Has nothing to do with research, though.
Right.
The reason why he lost his license. But he would be one of those 40%ers that did nothing, knew nothing about the trial, signed documents, as we're both well aware. And yeah, he didn't do physical exams, but he was more than happy to sign off on them. So as a matter of fact, he was his knowledge was so little in regards to research. At the time, this was when I first started in the industry, and I was a coordinator.
And he was your PI.
Correct.
Yeah.
And he was meeting with the monitor, the CRA, for a study, and he called me into the room, and the CRA was asking this doctor, and we're going to leave his name out here. He was asking this doctor about a specific assessment that the doctor was delegated to do, and his signature was on the document, and the CRA was asking about this assessment, and the doctor turned to me and said, "Do I do this?" Okay.
In front of the CRA?
In front of the CRA. And I really had no idea what to do. I laughed and I said, "Well, why are you joking around?" Like, of course you do.
And what did the CRA say or do?
Well, this is another funny aspect of the industry. CRAs that have previously been coordinators typically know how this industry works. and this particular CRA had previously been a coordinator. So I'm sure he was fully aware of what was going on there.
Because this kind of stuff goes on all the time.
Yep.
We're not talking about fraud. I don't think that's going on all the time in research. It's going on.
Technically, that is fraud, though.
Technically, it is. But what I consider fraud would be making up patient data.
Yeah.
Patients don't exist. I would say 1% or even less of sites engage in that kind of activity.
Sure.
I would say 60 to 80 engage or flirt with, whether on purpose or inadvertently, with a lack of proper PI oversight.
Yeah, I would guess that's right.
In every study.
I would say at least 75%. I would say it's higher than 60.
And CROs know this. They've known this for years, and I believe this is one of the reasons why they were pushing for risk-based monitoring. And they were looking for the green light from the FDA to tell them, hey, CRO, you don't have to source data verify every data point in the study.
Mm-hmm.
The site and the PI, that's their responsibility. But you do need to assign a risk profile to each site, and then you need to get in there and train and retrain on the protocol, retrain on GCP if needed. And we're going to get into how big data and analytics is going to be a huge driving force in this industry going forward. And we're going to be able to detect quickly fraud, right? And we have a question, we're going to get to it, and then also to some extent PI oversight. So anything else you want to add before we get into this question?
No, I'm curious what the question is.
It's a good one. So if a site is found to have fraud, is everyone in the group, PI, study coordinator, etc., charged with fraud, or just the PI?
So now so it depends.
Every situation is different.
Yes. So first and foremost, the PI is responsible for everything. Now, it depends on the type of or level of fraud I think you're talking about. If you're talking about making up patients, like completely making up patients, then I think it would be more than just the PI that would be involved there. I think anybody with knowledge of this would pay a price. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, you'd have to find out who is charging. So if it's the FDA, obviously, that's the federal government. Yeah. So I'm sure they have their own procedures on how to handle these things, especially when it comes to fraud. If it's a sponsor that discovered it, chances are they're going to want to sweep it under the rug somehow because they're worried. Or, there's two ways.
They might be proactive and go to the FDA.
Right. Yeah, there's two ways they go about it, and probably a lot in between. They could try to sweep it under the rug if it's minor or minimal, or if it just happened once. And don't let that site enroll anymore, so that site would be discontinued.
Sure.
And not say anything to the FDA because there's not enough data. So, that's a risk they would take. Or they could be proactive and go to the FDA and say, hey, unfortunately, we chose this site. This is what they've been doing. This is what we discovered it. We're doing our due diligence, and we're letting you know that the data from this site's not going to be used in the study. So the FDA might then say, scrap the whole study.
Well, not like that, but I'm sure that would instigate an FDA audit.
Of course, yeah.
Went to the FDA.
The FDA would come in, and then there would be charges.
And so, answer to this question, I think anybody who had knowledge of that going on, that patients were being made up, would be in trouble.
And can you clarify the person who asked the question, embezzlement and no source?
So
what does that mean?
And if we're talking about fraud, like we're talking about with the doctor that when I very first started in this industry, what he was doing, and again, I was the coordinator at the time. I don't think I would pay a price for that. I don't think.
No.
That would, because the patient was real, just the doctor wasn't doing as he was supposed to be doing, the PI.
And the PI was backdating.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, from what I understand, and even I've interviewed FDA auditors in the past, the fact of the matter is that the FDA really doesn't have that many teeth when it comes to this stuff. So, like, they can't even strip a doctor of their license unless it's something horrible that they did.
Yeah,
Like
jeopardizing patient safety.
Jeopardize patient safety. But if it's just backdating or committing fraud in some other way, shape, or form, they could blacklist that PI from research.
Oh, absolutely.
And so can sponsors and CROs. That's their own decision. But the FDA can do that. But they can't really, they don't even have the power to take away license from a doctor. So that doctor who committed fraud and is blackballed from research, unfortunately, can still have a private practice, right?
Well, I'm sure they can refer it to the state, though.
They can.
License
Yeah.
and say, listen, this doctor is not providing oversight and he's endangering patients. And they lose their license that way.
They can, and they certainly can become in danger of doing that. But as you know, we're talking about huge bureaucracies that don't communicate well.
Sure.
Right? So I don't understand what the embezzlement and no source. Embezzlement would be a private matter, and then not having source documents is what I'm assuming would be not complying with GCP. So those wouldn't necessarily be fraud. They would be certainly PI oversight and not being compliant with GCP. Right? That's the second part of the question.
Embezzlement, that would lead me to think they're talking about the site, right? Embezzling from the site. So
embezzling from the site or embezzling from the sponsor.
How would you embezzle from the sponsor?
Making up fake patients and just billing for that.
That's fraud. Complete fraud.
But that'd still be a private matter between the sponsor and the site. So they'd probably take them to arbitration, because in every contract there's an arbitration clause. Right. So the site would lose that. Yeah, embezzlement of funds from sponsor. So the site would lose that for sure, easily, and probably be reported to the FDA. The FDA would probably audit that site. The FDA would find a lot of major findings, and that PI would be blacklisted from the industry.
And potentially coordinator as well.
Have you ever heard? So you've talked to a lot of CRAs. Have you ever heard of a coordinator being blackballed?
I have.
You have?
And for this case.
Who?
It was at an investigational meeting, and it wasn't a CRA. It was another coordinator who was talking about their PI. And it's just, I don't remember all of the details, but it was something about a coordinator that this person knew that got blacklisted along with the PI. For making up patients.
Making up patients. Mm-hmm. So who blacklisted them? The FDA?
Yeah. I assume.
Okay.
At the time, I didn't get, again, I don't recall the specifics and details, but it was, coordinator and PI.
Did they get jail time?
I don't recall that being the case.
Because there have been cases of PIs that face jail time.
For research?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, I remember there was two doctors somewhere around here.
They got in trouble with the Securities and Exchange Commission because they were doing a clinical trial for a biotech company.
Right.
And they saw that it wasn't working in their patients, and it was a very small clinical trial. Mm-hmm. So they had 50% of the sample size.
Like $200,000 in stock or something.
Yeah, and they sold it all before the public knew.
Yeah.
And so they didn't lose money, but the public did.
Yeah.
And so they traded on inside. But that's a SEC issue.
Yeah. It
wasn't an FDA issue. But they did do jail time, but that was from the SEC side.
Right.
But I've read of stories, and this was back in 05, 06, when I first got started, that some investigators have faced jail time for committing fraud.
As they should. Making up patients is, what's the ultimate goal here? To see if the drug works, right?
That's right. And so it is a public safety issue too.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so.
So there's excellent cases that could be made about that. Now, what's interesting here is going forward, and no matter what conference you go to, CROs, sponsors, they're all talking about big data in risk-based monitoring. So things like being able to process very quickly, actually in real time, the data as it's being entered onto the source. So now, 2017, right? We're about to enter it. Mm-hmm. We have a new study at one of our clinics. They received a bunch of iPads with styluses. Mm-hmm. So that is for all the assessments and many of the source documents.
Well, now they're recording majority of the assessments, especially the primary endpoints.
Right, but they're even recording the writing, right? So I think we're gone pretty soon. The days of backdating are gone.
And if you really think about it, it makes sense. If you were a sponsor,
I would absolutely do this, and we're working towards getting to that point.
If you're paying an MD to do a specific task, and you know full well that that's not occurring at a vast majority of your sites.
You can use all kinds of technology to make sure that that's...
Yes, to get what you're paying for.
That's right. And we are working towards this. This is why we started with sites. Now we're entering the CRO space.
Yep.
The goal is to get into the biotech sponsor side. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be super strict as a sponsor, and you're supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you want to see whether the drug legitimately works, whether it's legitimately safe. You want the good data, right? So big data is coming out. So they're going to be able to see the written down source on these iPads. It's going to be tracked in real time, everything timestamped to the microsecond, uploaded instantly to the cloud. Like, this is already happening. This is not in the future.
Yeah,
this is a study we have right now.
Yeah.
Right. And then the assessments, they're audio recorded, some are video recorded. The handwriting is looked at, like they'll see how it's being signed. They don't just see the finished product as the signature. They'll see how it was signed. So they'll be able to tell if it's original or if someone else is copying that signature. I mean, that's just part of the big data. The other part is all the EDC, all the data that's being entered into these databases. So they're going to be looking at things like favorite numbers, because sites that commit fraud or just make up data tend to use over a period of time the same numbers repeatedly just because they're lazy. It's human nature. Also, they'll be able to see which sites are over-reporting and under-reporting serious adverse events, which ones are not reporting any at all. So that's not necessarily fraud, but that's not following GCP or having PI oversight at best.
Sure.
At worst, it's fraud.
Sure. Well, I mean, with AEs, for example, as you said, if it's a 6-week trial, sure, all your patients in that trial could go potentially without an AE. I mean, I typically don't go 6 weeks without some sort of abnormal occurrence, a headache or indigestion or something in that 6-week period, but it could happen. It could happen.
Right.
You're talking a 6-month trial? No, it's not going to happen. Everybody's going to have an AE.
So I think that there's always going to be ways to cut corners, right? People are always going to find ways. But I think the days of cutting corners, like the industry was accustomed to, like you said, 60 to 80% that don't always follow GCP and don't always have adequate PI oversight, I think those days are numbered because of things like real-time technology, right? And wait till virtual reality comes into this.
Yeah.
We're not that far from that.
Sure.
So what it's going to do from a business perspective for the research sites out there, obviously this helps the CROs, this helps the sponsors. It could help the sites too. And the reason why it could help the sites is a whole bunch of sites are going to be blacklisted, whether informally or formally.
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, I'm sure it will be somewhat, but what I see more likely happening is when it's absolutely 100% required. I mean, it already is required, but there are technologies in place that make it so the doctor actually has to do what they're supposed to do,
right?
Whether it be the PI or sub or whatnot,
right?
There's going to be many doctors that are just going to say, I'm not interested in more research.
There's going to be many sites that are going to say, hey, I can't do this study. Send me another one. And pretty soon those are going to be less.
Yeah. And then there'll be no more.
And then there'll be no more. And so those sites would have those PIs or sites would have naturally gotten weeded out. There's companies like Drug Dev, like BioClinica. There's others. Hopefully our CRO can get into this. Actually, we need to get into this. That's probably the next step after we get a few gigs, is aggregating metrics from sites. That's what they're doing. So Drug Dev, I can't remember if it was Drug Dev or BioClinica, what they said they're doing, they're tracking all the stuff we just talked about. Like they're tracking everything. They're tracking screen fails. They're comparing your feasibilities survey responses versus what you actually did. Like anything you can think of, they're tracking, they're aggregating, and they're using to create a credit score for each site.
Makes sense.
It's called Gold Standard. I can't remember which company it was exactly, but they're all doing something similar. Quintiles is doing PPD. They're all doing this.
Well,
right? This is something we're going to do.
Sure, but I can't imagine anybody has a very high score on that feasibility questionnaire.
Right.
I think
Everyone
exaggerates on that.
exaggerates. Yeah. That's graded on a curve.
Yeah, I would
right?
think. I would think.
So a 30% could still be an A.
Exactly. A
Right.
plus.
Right. But the point is, things are getting fairly serious out there.
Sure.
When it comes to this, and like, you cannot hide from numbers, data, metrics. Like, these are all being used, and the sites that are able to adapt are going to be the ones that get all the market share, and the ones that can't are either going to be blacklisted formally, informally. They just won't be invited to more studies, or they'll just drop themselves out.
That'll be attrition.
Right?
Yeah.
Anything else? Hey, no problem. You're a little late. It's okay. This replay will be on YouTube. So get your last questions in. Chris, closing remarks. I've already had mine.
Plenty of them.
Right. That's right.
So nothing really comes to mind. And anybody who listens to this at a later time, if you're in a situation where your PI is not involved as they should be, it might be time to start looking for a new PI. If you want to continue doing research.
So this is our sales pitch.
Yeah.
If you need help with any of this, not just finding a new PI, but making sense out of all these changes happening in the industry, or getting studies, or having us negotiate your budgets, or creating the source documents, or, very fitting for this webinar, having our quality assurance team come to your site on a regular basis.
Sure.
Right? We do all this and more for our clients. We do consulting. It's part of our CRO infrastructure we're trying to build. Not only do we own sites, we consult with a lot of sites. Okay, so if you need our consulting services for anything, biz dev, regulatory, QA, contracts and budgets, source documents, trainings, finding PIs, right? Give me a call or email 949-415-6256, 949-415-6256. One last question. May we request sponsor to change the PI? Yes.
To elaborate, though.
Elaborate.
So there's a couple of catches here. If you were just awarded the trial and you request a PI change, you may lose that trial because they really haven't invested a whole lot in your site yet. If you can, it's best to have a subject enrolled first and not completed before you ask for a PI change. In my opinion,
right?
You're much more likely to get your request and keep the trial. Of course, they're going to have to vet the PI first, as they did with the original PI. But that being said, they're much more likely if there's data at your site to allow your site to remain in the trial, to keep the trial. So yeah, it's a risk if you have no patients enrolled to switch your PI.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Remember, 949-415-6256, Dan at theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Make sure you're following GCP. Make sure you have adequate PI oversight. And don't commit fraud. You may end up in jail.
Yes. Never make up patients.
All right.
And if you can, follow, as you said, GCP and the protocol 100%.
When you can, and it's going to be more and more the case that you will have to. They'll be able to track, right? Right now, everyone's taking everyone's word for it.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to change. It already is changing, and it's not even 2017 yet.
We're spending $1.5 billion from chemical compound to release a drug, right? To get through that process, you would do the same.
I would be a very involved sponsor.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Dan and Chris, talk to you all soon. Bye-bye. How about that webinar we just did?
It was good. It was good. Hopefully the FDA doesn't come knocking asking more questions, but
And hopefully sponsors, biotechs, med device companies watch, and they give us a call because we're a CRO and we can help you get your product to market with good data.